break. So again, we won't be meeting next week. No one will be here. Then we will resume back here the Wednesday after break. If there's any changes to that, I will be sure to let you know. But the plan is to be back here in person on Wednesday. But I'll reach out to the speaker and make sure. Any questions, concerns before we get started? Everybody's good? Okay. I'm going to start over here with you guys. Great. All right. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrea Etter from Food and Nutrition Sciences at the University of Vermont. And as you can see, she's talking about food safety and backyard chickens. So I'm looking forward to a great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I also went to a pretty small undergrad, teaching focused, didn't do any undergrad research. And from there I went to Purdue University for my PhD, which was a bit of a change. So it's nice to be at a small university and talking to you guys today. So the genesis of this project actually goes back to my childhood growing up in rural Wisconsin. So despite the title today, I have to admit that there are pictures of me as a small child kissing chicks because I didn't know any better. And I live to tell the tale. So yes, you can kiss a chick and live to tell the tale, but I don't recommend it. And we'll get into a bit more on that later. So salmonella is one of the almost three pathogens I work with in my laboratory at the University of Vermont. And salmonella is interesting to us because it is one of the most prevalent causes of foodborne illness in the United States, and actually in the world as well. It's not discriminatory. It affects high-income countries. It affects low-income countries. And it's also very expensive for the US, despite the fact that most people are going to go ahead and be better in a few days, often without antibiotics or hospitalization. Enough people become ill each year and lose enough time at work and require enough treatment that it costs billions of dollars. And these are estimates because a lot of times when people get sick, they don't go to the doctor. But they might still have to take time off of work. They might, and sometimes when they do become sick, they're going to end up going to the doctor. Mortality refers to how much will we pay to avoid the risk of death. This number, importantly, does not include recalls or the loss of product when a company has to pull it off the market due to salmonella contamination. So if you were to include that, this number would be much, much higher. So the reason we're talking about chickens today is that chickens and chicken products are a major source, if not the major source, of salmonella in the US. Chickens and salmonella get along really, really well. They can carry salmonella without any symptoms as adults. Sometimes they'll have symptoms, but they can be completely asymptomatic carriers. And this is going to be potentially in their feathers, on their feathers, in their follicles, definitely in their intestines. And some of this has to do with how chickens interact with the world around them. If you've ever had a chicken, you know that they like to dust bathe. This is an important way for them to clean their feathers, but they're not super picky about where they dust bathe. So they will happily dust bathe in an area they pooped in 2 days ago, where it's now dried. And salmonella survives really well in the environment. It can be in soil, it can be in water, you find it on produce. And even if the chicken itself wasn't carrying salmonella a few days before, if you had a rodent or a wild bird going through there and pooping, they can have salmonella. I do a program called Skype a Scientist every year, and I Skype classrooms or Zoom into classrooms with children from the ages of like kindergarten through high school. And one of the classrooms, the kids kept asking me, well, can this animal have salmonella? Can that animal have salmonella? So I'm like frantically Googling And it turns out pretty much any animal you think of can have salmonella. But one of the things that makes chickens and salmonella an especial risk is their actual anatomy. So chickens, unlike humans, do not have multiple outlets for waste and such. They have one. It's called the cloaca. And they lay eggs out of that outlet, they poop out of that outlet, they have sex through that outlet. It sounds really, really disgusting, but it works well for chickens. But the implications of that is that if there is salmonella in the intestines from something they ate maybe, and this is where salmonella is going to colonize, this cloaca is connected to the shell gland where the egg is forming. And so you can actually have salmonella travel up into here and infect the egg before there is a shell and be on the inside. Or, the egg's going to come out through the cloaca. Even if the salmonella doesn't get inside the egg is going to come into contact with the same mucous membrane that just had poop coming through it. And so it can be on the outside as well. So I heard somebody saying, don't tell me not to kiss my chicken. I love my chicken. And this is one of the main problems with backyard chickens that we have in the US. Chickens are increasingly becoming thought of as pets. And they are a lot of fun. They have a lot of personality. If you've never interacted with chickens, this might be surprising, but it's true. And so this is a screen grab of a video that was circulating on Facebook in, I think, 2019. And it was a woman who had adopted a rooster, and she let him make her bed every morning with his feet. And in fact, there is a thriving industry for chicken diapers if you want to have a chicken indoors and you don't want to try to toilet train him. But obviously, not everyone's going to let a chicken make their bed with his feet, but lots of us would be comfortable holding a chicken and petting it and maybe even kissing it. Now, there's two different responses to this. One is like, of course, and the other is, who in their right mind would kiss a chicken? Do people actually do that? To which I would say, yes, they actually do that because I've done it and I know I've seen a lot of pictures of people doing it. And of course, kids. Kids love fluffy things. And what is cuter and more fluffy than a chick or a chicken, but especially a chick? Well, unfortunately, kids are also more likely to get seriously ill from salmonella. So this love of soft, fluffy things is a bit of a hazard to them and their health. And of course, most people, if they have chickens, do in fact eat the eggs. There are probably a few vegans who have chickens, but most people have chickens, at least in part, for the eggs. And if you're not really thinking of your chicken as potentially being sick with something that could make you sick, perhaps you're not going to be super careful with how you handle the eggs. And of course, eggs don't have to look dirty to be dirty, like to have salmonella on them. An egg that looks perfectly pristine could still have salmonella on the exterior. And then there's a lot of theories that go around about how you should treat eggs. There's a number of different ideas about that can lead to actually the growth of salmonella on the exterior or the interior of the egg. And then, of course, if you sell eggs to others and your chickens have salmonella, you're now potentially spreading the problem around your community. Again, nobody's regulating selling eggs, nor necessarily should they, but it's going to make it harder to trace, potentially, if you're giving away eggs to half your neighbors and some of them are getting sick. They may not remember where they got the eggs. Okay, so I've had a lot of ifs and maybes. What is the actual scope of the problem? Well, it turns out this is something the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, keeps track of. And they have kept track of it since about 2011, when there were fewer than 100 cases of salmonella that were thought to involve live poultry. So if you get salmonella and you go to a doctor and you're diagnosed, the local health department will probably contact you and give you a survey to find out what you potentially got sick with. And one of the things they ask about if it's salmonella is, do you have contact with live chickens? And if you answer yes, then that's going to be put on the record, especially if there's no other potential obvious sources of salmonella. What you can see here is that the amount of cases associated with live poultry has really gone up over the years. It's a little bit of a bumpy line, but the average is trending upward. And last year was the all-time high with about 1,700 cases of salmonella. And of course, if you were on social media, you know a lot of people got chickens last year, so that's not entirely surprising. But this year we're at about, we're at close to 1,000 cases, and the year is not over. They will continue to track cases of salmonella associated with backyard chickens until the end of the year. Yeah.
Well, I didn't see people get chickens last year. Were they just lonely?
Yeah, for some degree. You know, in COVID, like some people, they started making sourdough. Some people had a garden. Some people bought chickens. Chickens were extremely popular last year, enough so that it was actually an NPR article that chick suppliers and hatcheries and stores are running out of chicks to sell. So I started being interested in backyard chickens and salmonella in 2019 when I saw an article about that. And so I decided to go digging and find out if Vermont had any data on backyard chicken associated illnesses from salmonella. And it turns out if you ask the Department of Health very nicely, sometimes they will give you numbers. They did have numbers. So going back to 2016, we see that there's about 100 cases of salmonella every year in Vermont that are reported, you know, where somebody's gone to the doctor, they were tested, and it came up as salmonella. And somewhere between 12 and 30 of these had live poultry exposure, and it's reasonable to think that they got this from live chickens. So it's not an enormous problem in Vermont, but it's not tiny. And if we look at who's getting sick, I was actually able to get age data. 30% of the people who are getting sick from backyard chickens are kids. And this is important because kids are more likely to get seriously ill. And of course, if you're a parent, your kid getting sick is very distressing as well. There's some seasonality. Most people get sick during the spring to summer, but again, this makes sense because that's usually when people are outside more and interacting with their chickens more, or maybe buying new chickens. So in 2019, we started this study with the goal of sampling a lot of Vermont backyard flocks and determining how common salmonella was in these flocks and what the owners knew about what were good practices and what they were reporting to us that they actually were doing when they interacted with their chickens. We weren't actually observing them, so we don't know what they actually did, but we could at least ask them what they thought they did. Reported actions and actual actions are unfortunately not always the same. So in 2019, we sampled about 28 flocks, primarily in Chittenden County. UVM is in Chittenden County. It's a little bit easier to get the word out. But we've been trying to expand our reach, and since then we've sampled a number of other flocks for a total of 41 flocks since starting in 2019 through now. This is a total of 430 chickens. We had one of these flocks wasn't really a backyard flock, but we included it in the data. It was a small business, actually. And these were mostly adult chickens. We had a few juvenile chickens, but no really young chicks here. And this is a mix of urban and rural flocks, which I want you to remember because this will become important later. We had 15 urban flocks and 20 rural flocks, so about 50-50. And then we had a few flocks that were somewhere in between. There's a lot of houses nearby. It's not really in town, but it's not really rural where there's like big open fields around it.
Did you purposely get some from Pulteney?
Yes, one of my students had family in Pulteney, so that was how we got that. Yeah. So this was obviously a sample of convenience. We couldn't get a completely randomized sample because we had to rely on people who are willing to let us swab their chickens and fill out the survey. And okay. All right, so the way you test a chicken for salmonella traditionally is to have a swab. This is the first undergrad who worked with me on the project and is currently a grad student. Her name is Melissa. And so we would have to catch the chickens, and most of the time people would be nice and make sure the chickens were indoors, but every now and then we had to deal with somebody who didn't have any fencing and whose chickens were outdoors, and we got a lot of exercise that way. And so we'd hold the chicken, wear gloves, and we'd have that swab, and we'd insert it in its cloaca and swirl it around to try to get a good amount of fecal matter on there, at least visible staining. And yes, we had chickens poop on us because it turns out when you stick something up a chicken's butt, they aren't always happy. So they recover pretty quickly. I've definitely had chickens like running around my feet 2 seconds after I swabbed them, and I'm like, I'm not sure why you're hanging around me. I wouldn't be hanging around me in your shoes, but whatever, chicken.
Did they ever like scratch you?
Oh yeah, there's definitely ones that scratch. Definitely been hit in the face by chicken wings, pooped on. One farm had bees and I got stung while trying to catch a chicken that had managed to escape while we were trying to get another chicken out of the coop. So all sorts of adventures. But when we'd bring that swab back to the lab, we would do a process called enrichment. So the first thing to do is to put it into a broth that allows the bacteria to grow. And when you're dealing with a swab, there's not that many bacteria there in the first place, so you want to give everything a chance to grow. So the first broth we put it in was non-selective, and anything could grow, any bacteria that could handle oxygen. But then the next step was to put it in 2 different broths, these slightly greenish ones here, that wouldn't let everything grow. They would let salmonella grow, and they'd let some other things grow. So they'd whittle that down and increase the amount of the proportion of salmonella present while preventing other things from growing. But then the final step is really to streak it out onto this red media, which kind of looks like red Jell-O and actually smells really good when you're making it, but is very much not edible, and see what grows. And so here you can see we've got a lot of bacterial colonies growing, and some of them are yellow and have stained the background yellow, and some of them are black. And this black one here is a salmonella colony, or it is probably a salmonella colony. That's what salmonella looks like on a plate. We have to run a final test, a PCR, to ensure that it is in fact salmonella, but we would call this plate positive. You can see that there's a bunch of different things on this plate. We've got a bunch of black colonies here, and we've got some yellow colonies, and then we've got some sort of beige colonies. And that's because things that are very closely related to salmonella can also grow on this plate. But this is our primary method of determining whether or not a chicken might have salmonella.
Is it like chicken medicine to get rid of it?
You could give them antibiotics. A lot of times, if you come back and retest a couple weeks later, the chicken has already gotten rid of it. But not always. So as I mentioned earlier, the very first year we tested, we didn't find any salmonella. The next year we tested, we found 1 flock that had salmonella. And this year we have found 5 flocks that have salmonella. And if you look at how many birds out of the total have salmonella, it's pretty rare for a bird to have salmonella. But if you think about the likelihood that a flock you interact with might have a chicken with salmonella in it, it's actually pretty common. So about 15% of flocks in Vermont have a chicken that has salmonella. And so if you think about, you go to your friend's house or your relative's house or your neighbor's house and they have chickens, there's a 50% or 15% chance that one of those chickens might have salmonella. And one interesting thing here is that it was much more common in rural flocks. So in the city, we only found one flock that had salmonella. The rest of them were all rural flocks. And so I'm not the only person who has looked at salmonella in backyard chickens. A study in Massachusetts that was published in 2018 looked at 53 different flocks in the greater Boston urban area, and they found one flock that had salmonella. This was a type of salmonella that we're actually not very worried about. It doesn't tend to cause human illness. So they sort of said, hey, salmonella is not that big of a problem in backyard chickens. In Washington State, a group tested 34 flocks. They published this last year. And they found one flock that was positive for Salmonella typhimurium, which actually causes a lot of illnesses in the US. So this was a bit more concerning. However, we've tested 41 flocks and we found 6 flocks that have salmonella. So we are really breaking the curve here. And I think this is again because these other 2 studies actually are primarily, if not entirely, urban flocks. And if you recall, we only found salmonella in 1 urban flock. And we found salmonella in 5 rural flocks. So I think there's something about being a rural flock that makes it more likely to have salmonella. Interestingly enough, if we look at studies from around the world, Australia has its own fair share of backyard chickens, and they've done some studies. And they found about 10% of their flocks had salmonella. But we're at 15%, so we're higher than Australia too.
Do you have any hypotheses why the rural ones are more likely to get it?
So I think it's actually because they're more likely to interact with wildlife. There's going to be a lot more birds and rodents and other mammals out there that they could potentially interact with. They're also more likely to be free range than the ones in town. And so that increases the likelihood also of them interacting with wildlife. But we don't know for sure. We also don't know for sure why Vermont has so much higher rates than, say, Australia, which was also looking at a lot of, I think, rural flocks. So it's hard to say. A lot of questions. The best studies give you more questions than answers, I think. And then really one of the things that's coming up this year is, why are we finding so much more salmonella this year? Is it just an especially bad year? And we don't have a really good reason or answer for that, but we're going to keep testing next year and the year after and the year after. And hopefully by the time we get done with this study, we'll have an answer. If there's really a reason that we can think of that some years have a lot more salmonella in the chickens than others. Because it is entirely possible that we just happened to test more flocks this year that just happened to have salmonella, and it's all pure random chance. Or there could actually be a reason behind it.
And maybe because you said there was a lot last year, right?
Well, no, we sampled about 10 flocks last year and we found one that had salmonella, which is more than we found the first year, but the first year we also tested a lot of urban flocks. And last year was also more urban flocks, and then this year I think we've had maybe more rural, so that could be an answer.
I was wondering if it's like COVID and we're all inside, maybe that more animals come out and there's more chance for them to...
That's a really good hypothesis, actually. So yeah, that could be something that would be affecting it. There has also been an outbreak of salmonella in wild birds this year, so that's a possible other option. So we were able to survey these owners, and one of the things we asked them was why they had chickens. And this being Vermont, it's perhaps not super surprising that the primary reason, the top 2 reasons, were in fact sustainability. I don't know that you'd find that in other states. But the third choice, the most popular third choice, was in fact pets are fun. So that is kind of important to think about. This is again Melissa. This is a picture she gave me from growing up. She grew up with chickens. Not a good practice, by the way. So people told us that overall 70% of them avoided snuggling their chickens. And 90% said they avoided kissing their chickens. And 45% said they tried to keep kids from snuggling chickens, but we forgot to ask people if they had kids interacting with their chickens. So it's unclear if only 45% of them had kids interacting with their chickens or what exactly that meant. So survey design can cause you headaches. 86% of owners reported washing their hands after handling their flock, which is a good practice. And 90% said they washed their hands after handling the eggs at least some of the time. There were about 25% of people who said they washed their hands only if the eggs were dirty. Now keep in mind, an egg looking dirty and an egg being dirty are not the same thing. So that's not the greatest response rate. And only half of the owners reported changing shoes after being around birds and pens. Now, if you think about chicken coops, they're not the cleanest places. Chickens lay semi-solid feces, and you probably don't want to be walking back into the house in the same shoes that you wore in your chicken coop. So this rate should really be a lot higher. Now, if you have kids in the household, you definitely don't want to be wearing those shoes inside, especially if they're of the age that they're crawling around on the floor. A third of the owners said they didn't refrigerate their eggs. Now, this is something that has been influenced by the fact that Europeans don't refrigerate their eggs. And so there's a lot of talk online in backyard chicken communities about whether or not you really need to refrigerate your eggs. I will say that if you don't refrigerate your eggs and you happen to have salmonella on the inside, your salmonella will grow really well while it's out on the counter. Where if you refrigerate it, the salmonella is not going to be able to grow, assuming your refrigerator is at the right temperature. And of course, if you have salmonella on the outside of your egg and you're leaving it out, it will grow as well. But more concerningly, about 10% of people said they washed their eggs and then they didn't refrigerate them. And if you wash your egg and then you don't refrigerate it, you've actually removed a protective coating off the outside. And so now any bacteria in the air or the environment can get into the inside of the egg. So even if your egg didn't originally have salmonella, if you have salmonella on your countertop or something, or E. coli or something else, it can get into the egg. And yes, that's an entirely plausible scenario for those of you who are wondering how that would ever happen. Yes?
I do have a question. I grew up with chickens, but how do you know when you crack an egg if there's salmonella in it?
You don't.
You don't? Okay.
It's completely impossible to detect.
Okay.
So in commercial eggs, about 1 in every 20,000 eggs is estimated to have salmonella in it when it reaches the consumer to a level that can make a consumer sick. We don't have good data on backyard chickens. We had originally planned to look at the eggs, but then we were finding so little salmonella that we gave up on that. And then we haven't gotten back to the idea of looking at that. So that would be interesting to look at, yeah.
Is eating raw cookie dough still a big problem for salmonella?
Well, if you make it with conventional eggs, again, every 1 in every 20,000, it depends. Conventional eggs are relatively safe for salmonella. There's a possibility your flour could have E. coli in it. If you fall into any of these somewhat higher risk categories, so you are immunocompromised in any way, or pregnant, or above the age of 65, or are a small child, you should probably not eat cookie dough. Otherwise, you can decide how much you are worried about getting foodborne illness. So it's complicated. And only 7% of owners reported wearing a mask when cleaning the coop. Now, if you think about a coop, it can get pretty dry and dusty, like the poop solidifies and then it gets dusty and crumbles. And so if you're cleaning the coop and you're using a lot of scrubbing action and maybe not a lot of water, you're going to be, and you're not wearing a mask, you're going to be inhaling all that dust and swallowing it and getting it in your face. And so it's actually a pretty good way to get salmonella. So wear a mask if you clean your chicken coop. Um, 83% of backyard chicken owners were aware that their chickens could have salmonella, but they actually weren't terribly worried about it. So we asked them questions about how safe they thought their chickens' eggs were. And 45% thought their eggs were probably safer than store-bought, which is pretty high. It's not quite half, but people were pretty confident in their backyard chickens, or in backyard chicken eggs, in backyard chicken eggs in general. So 45% thought they were equally safe to store-bought, 30% about the same. Few people thought they were less safe, but remember, these are backyard chicken owners, so apparently they weren't that worried. When we asked people what they thought about their own chickens' eggs, they were a lot more confident. So we go up from 45% to 52% who think it's safer than store-bought. And now we have only 17% who think it's less safe. This is very interesting. Any idea why people might be more confident in their own chickens? Yeah.
Because you know exactly what chicken is.
Yeah, they know everything about the chicken, and so they assume their chicken is safe. I would argue that this is not necessarily an accurate perception, because remember, your chicken can be infected with salmonella without you knowing. And so your chicken could be laying eggs that have salmonella in them without you knowing, because you can't tell if an egg's contaminated with salmonella. A colleague of mine likes to refer to people's overconfidence in food products raised by people they know or by themselves as faith-based food safety. It's a little bit derogatory, but basically, just because you know the person whose chickens these are or whose cow you're getting raw milk from does not actually make it safer. You don't have an agreement with the bacteria. They really don't care.
They might just be like cocky, so if some people see them as like pets, and you know people with their kids that are really protected, like, oh, my kid would never.
And that.
Oh, my chicken would never have salmonella.
That too. They think, they think their chicken somehow has an agreement with salmonella. Their chicken does not have an agreement with salmonella. I hate to break that to you. So when we compare this with other surveys, we do actually see a slightly lower uptake of good practices than a similar study in Seattle found. And we do definitely see that people think that their own chickens and their own chickens' eggs are safer, and that maybe this isn't entirely warranted, but it's definitely a perception. Okay, so in 2020, having not really found any salmonella the previous year in adult chickens, we decided to go looking for where else it might be hiding out. And a logical next step seemed to be chicks. And originally we had planned to, get people who had bought chicks to let us come to their houses and do cloacal swabs on their chicks. But of course, in March of 2020, we went into lockdown. So that was not going to be a possibility. But we did have some data to suggest that this would be a more fruitful course of inquiry based on a study that showed us that 65% of illnesses associated with backyard chickens were actually associated with baby birds. And also a Michigan Department of Health study that sampled at agricultural supply stores, got the shipping boxes from them, and found that 26% of them contained salmonella. And also that many of the salmonella that they were finding matched outbreaks that were ongoing in humans. So we decided, so what actually happened is COVID happened, UVM shut down, and I thought we weren't going to get any data that year. But my undergrad, Kata, who's actually here today, works at an agricultural supply store back home in Massachusetts. And so she texted me and said, I think the owner of the store, my boss, will let me take samples and I can freeze them and bring them back when I come back to UVM. Are you interested? And so I agreed, and she was able to bring back a lot of samples. In the meantime, so when she said this, then I decided to do some digging around and see what else I could get in Vermont, because why not? We made the decision at this point to move to the bedding sampling versus the cloacal swabs, because cloacal swabs weren't going to happen. And bedding sampling gave us a lot more flexibility for testing samples, freezing samples, and coming back to them later. So in 2020, we were able to get a total of 80 samples, 10 from a Vermont hatchery, 56 from CADA from Massachusetts, 1 from an agricultural supply store in Vermont that we were able to get towards the end of the summer, and about 13 from individual flocks in Burlington, people who had young chickens. And then this year we continued. I called up a lot of different egg supply stores in Vermont and I said, hey, are you having chicks come this year? And they either said yes or no. And if they said yes, I said, hi, my name is Andrea Etter from the University of Vermont. I'm running a study on salmonella in baby chicks. Would you be willing to let me sample your baby chicks? And one person told me, my chicks don't have salmonella, but I don't want you to test them, just in case. And a lot of people said, sure, that sounds good. And other people said, no, our company policy, our chain policy is that we don't allow research on this unless it's approved at the company level, and this is a company in another state. Well, I figured I wasn't going to get anywhere with that company, so I gave up on them, which was maybe a little premature. But in 2021, we were able to sample at 8 stores or chains and at 3 hatcheries, or like people who hatched chicks on the farm and then sold them in Vermont. Okay, so when we're looking at bedding swabs, we're actually starting with usually a nice straw pack like that. It fits in that box that has those dividers. There's 25 chicks per pad. And by the time it reaches us, it's usually pretty dirty, which makes it perfect for grabbing a 25-gram sample, adding some broth, and using this lovely machine, which has paddles on the inside and is called a stomacher, to mix the sample really thoroughly with that broth and get all the bacteria out into the liquid. And from there, we do the same thing we talked about for the adults. We have this intermediate broth, and then we have these plates that we look at for salmonella. So in 2020, we had our 80 samples, and we had 1 positive sample. And this was from our agricultural supply store in Vermont. We took 1 sample from there, and we got lucky. It had salmonella. It was from turkeys, not chickens, but baby turkeys are really cute too, so we include them. Now, this is about a 1% prevalence of salmonella, but all of these didn't have salmonella. We were kind of confused about why, because we had read this other stuff that suggested that, maybe there'd be a lot more salmonella in these chicks, and then we weren't finding it. Well, as it turns out, there's this program that hatcheries can participate in. The big hatcheries you buy from online, like Hoover's or Cackle or Mount Healthy. And it's called NPIP, or the National Poultry Improvement Plan. And the stores CADA worked at purchased from NPIP hatcheries. And the hatchery in Vermont also was NPIP certified. And what this really means is that there's supposed to be these rigorous standards for reducing the amount of salmonella present in flocks so that your chicks are less likely to have salmonella. So in 2020, we were like, okay, looks like NPIP certification works really well. NPIP works as intended. And this was a very nice, tidy story for 2020. Any guesses what happened in 2021?
It was not good.
It was not a nice, tidy story. By the way, that's the NPIP logo. So in 2021, we have these blue bars for 2021, and then we have aggregate data from both years in pink. And what do you see on this chart? Is NPIP working well? This is positive, samples positive for Salmonella.
2021 is more than even all time.
Yeah, 2021 is really, really hot for Salmonella. Do we see fewer samples with Salmonella from NPIP stores? I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads no, and that is correct. We do not actually see anything good from NPIP stores in 2021. It is a hot mess. So we got about 200 samples this year, and we are actually still going through these samples. We have about 50 samples left in our freezer because you can freeze Salmonella and it won't die, that we are still working through. So this could still change a little bit. But so far, we've gotten through about 150 of the 200, and we're fairly confident in our story at this time. So what we're seeing here is that if we look at 2021, yes, the overall amount of Salmonella is much higher than it was in 2020. If we look at samples coming from hatcheries that are NPIP certified, we have an almost 40% positivity rate. Almost 40% of those samples have Salmonella in them. Now, to be fair, we don't know if one chick in that shipment had Salmonella or all of them, but it's like a daycare where one has Salmonella, a lot more of them are probably going to get it because they're all packed together. And if we look at non-NPIP, we actually see a lower rate of Salmonella in hatcheries that don't participate in this program than in the ones that do. And that's not supposed to be how it works. So the interesting thing is we still have a lower rate of Salmonella than the Maryland study. They had 26%. We have, for over 3 years, we have 16% for 2 years. That's good. But there are still a lot of questions. Like, what does this data mean, and why does it look the way it does? And this is one of these things where it's really complicated. So we asked the stores what hatchery they bought from, and they told us. And so if we break it down by hatchery, we see that this hatchery with the lowest level of Salmonella is a hatchery that is not NPIP certified. And it has 16% positive samples. And on the high end, we have a hatchery that has 80% positive samples, and it is NPIP certified. Now, the caveat here is that hatchery with 80% positive, we only have 19 samples from it, and we have about 60 samples from the other. But the middle ground is about 30%. We have about 60 samples from that one. So at very least, we're seeing about twice the rate of Salmonella in NPIP certified hatcheries than in the one that isn't NPIP certified. Okay, so I had to stop and think about this for a while because you would not expect this. But this is the nature of science. The data does not behave the way you think the data ought to behave. When you look closely at NPIP and the different programs they have, hatcheries participate in 3 main programs. The U.S. Pylori typhoid-free program, and typhoid, of course, is typhoid fever. You have to raise chicks that do not have typhoid, or sorry, Pylori typhoid, which causes a typhoid-like disease in chicks. So you cannot have chicks with that type of Salmonella in them. You cannot have avian influenza in your birds. And then the third program is Salmonella monitored. Any idea what Salmonella monitored means? Yeah.
Can you either like adapt to chickens that are constantly like always getting tested and having a positive result?
Yeah, so it means that they're doing testing. And supposedly what happens if they start finding a lot of Salmonella is the USDA works with the hatchery to find ways to reduce the amount of Salmonella. But what are we in the middle of? Pandemic. So everybody's stretched thin. So what I think we have happening here is we don't have the inspectors going to the farms. Everybody's stretched thin. These hatcheries still have maybe increased demand, and corners might be being cut. And the USDA doesn't have the time and the energy to chase down this hatchery and say, hey, get this under control or we're going to remove you from the program. And they might also think it's better to have an eye on this than to have no eye on it. And they're not necessarily expecting anyone to go and be testing all of this from a university. But we still have a lot of unanswered questions. And one of the big ones is, why are we seeing more salmonella in Vermont than other studies? Yes, we have the rural versus urban, but is that the only reason? Are Vermonters just more careless? Do people source things more poorly? I will say I think one of the possible causes is these backyard chicken swaps. So if you hang out on the Facebook pages about backyard chickens, there are these swaps that are held. I actually tried to get access to one of them, and I was told to test chickens there, see if the owners would let me test chickens there, and I was told that no, they thought it would be too stressful for the birds. But I think that had more to do with maybe not wanting to know if they were being a vector for disease spread. I'd love to have more of a clear sense of if our hypothesis on the rural versus urban chickens is true. That really is a thing that they have more exposure to wildlife that could have salmonella. I'm not really sure how to get a better answer on that, but it's something I'll keep thinking about. And then some of the answers that we are hoping that we should be able to get this year is, what type of salmonella is this? Because there's a lot of different types of salmonella that we could have. There's about, I forget if there's 5 or 8 different types of salmonella causing illness in humans from contact with backyard chickens this year. And I expect we'll find a lot of those types of salmonella in our birds as well, especially in the baby chicks. And then another thing is, are these salmonella, is there any antibiotic resistance? How many of you have heard of antibiotic resistance or multi-drug resistance? Yeah, I see a number of hands. So this can be a really big problem in agriculture, and it can hang out in wildlife populations, it can hang out in the soil. So I'd be curious, what is the profile of the salmonella in these birds? Even though probably most of them have not had antibiotics, it's entirely possible that they still have antibiotic resistance. And finally, perhaps most importantly, what can consumers do to reduce the risk of getting a salmonella positive bird, especially if they're buying chicks? I thought last year that the answer was buy NPIP. Yes, it's $1.50 more a bird, but you're gonna get a better bird. This year, I'm not really sure. Is there a way we can find to direct consumers to birds that are less likely to have salmonella? And then finally, how do we persuade people to be more careful with their chickens without trying to make it seem like they can't enjoy their chickens? And so this is one of the things I'm working on. This is a girl who graduated from Champlain College, and she's trying to get into the science, communication, graphic design world. And so she designed this for me. Now the CDC has a lot of different posters on this, but they tend to be very long and make it sound like you should treat your chicken like it has anthrax. And I think that's a little bit excessive. So I want to focus on the most important things, which really comes down to good hygiene is key to enjoying your chicken without the risk of salmonella. Don't put your chicken near your face. If you have kids interacting with your birds, supervise them so that they're not kissing the chick or, rubbing their hands all over their faces after petting it. Wash your hands afterwards. Wear different shoes. Wear a mask when you clean your coops. You're not inhaling salmonella. Yeah, and they're livestock. They can have diseases. They can have diseases they give to us, but it doesn't make them dangerous or scary. It just means we need to be knowledgeable and cautious. Unless, of course, you're a person at greater risk for serious illness, like a kid. So children under the age of 5 have developing immune systems, and so they are more likely to end up in the hospital if they get salmonellosis, because sometimes kids can't stop vomiting or having diarrhea, among other things. The elderly, it turns out after about 65, you're at higher risk of getting seriously sick from virtually anything. So that's a consideration. Immunocompromised persons is actually a really interesting category because it's not just, having HIV or something. It could be cancer. It could be having had an organ transplant. It could be having an autoimmune disease that maybe you take drugs for to tamp down your immune system. Diabetes is actually a risk factor. So anything that could potentially lower your body's ability to fight disease does put you at higher risk for serious illness from your birds and would warrant maybe being a little extra careful. And then pregnancy is an interesting one because, as it turns out, when you're pregnant, your body will actually turn down your immune system a few notches, because otherwise the immune system would go after the fetus because it recognizes that it doesn't exactly match the mom. So pregnant women have to also be a little careful because they can get sicker and sometimes things can get transmitted to the baby. But hygiene is key. So that is really the takeaway I want you to have. Yes, chickens can have salmonella, but if you practice good hygiene and sensible measures, you can enjoy the chickens with a relatively low risk of getting ill. And so with that, I would like to thank everybody who worked on this project. So the Vermont Agricultural Experiment Station is funded by the USDA. So the USDA funded this research. The University of Vermont gave Kate a scholarship this summer, so she was able to work on this all summer and get paid. There have been a lot of people who have helped with this project. So these are all undergrad researchers who have worked with me on this project on a longer term basis. And this doesn't even cover everybody who's helped with it at some point or another. And then of course, Elena Fortin did the flyer, and all of these beautiful pictures are from our CALS communication person who likes to hang around and take pictures in the lab and of chickens and such, because it's fun. All right, so with that, I will take any questions. And yeah.
I got a question. Yeah. I'm sorry, where did you say you was from again?
I'm from Wisconsin originally. Actually, Wisconsin is a lot like Vermont, so Vermont feels very homey.
Could you tell us about your schooling and how you got to where you are?
My schooling? Yes. So, wow, it's a long story. It's a bit unconventional. I grew up in rural Wisconsin. I was homeschooled, so I learned a lot of self-direction. As it turns out, homeschooling is great prep for grad school. And then I went to a small Baptist college for undergrad in Wisconsin. Felt very homey. The nice thing about that is there were 3 science professors and the classes were small, so I got to know all of them really well. And they really encouraged me to go to grad school. I don't think I'd have gone to grad school if they hadn't encouraged me to. And then I applied to a couple of different universities and got into Purdue and IU. Didn't realize they were football rivals because I don't pay attention to sports. And Purdue really felt like home, so that was where I ended up. And I studied microbiology, ended up working in a lab in the food science department. And that was where I figured out I wanted to be a professor, so kept going.
That's pretty funny. Purdue is a brand of chicken.
What?
Isn't Purdue a brand of chicken?
Yeah, there's a Purdue chicken, yeah.
So you were meant to study chickens?
I guess. So my family has a story that when I was about 8, I said I wanted to be a chicken farmer. And so they keep reminding me of this now. They're like, look, you're fulfilling your childhood dream. Yeah.
Do different species of chickens have different rates of salmonella?
So we are actually keeping track of the species, or of the breeds of chickens to find out if there's a rate. So far, I haven't actually looked at that on the chick data. We don't have enough samples with the adults, but that is something we've tracked and intended to look at deeper with the chicks. Because there are breeds that are supposed to be more susceptible, like leghorns, but I don't know if there are breeds that are less susceptible. Yeah.
So people debate a lot about how you're supposed to take care of eggs to get them the cleanest and make them last the longest. What do you think are the best policies around getting the eggs clean and keeping them from growing their salmonella?
So where I've come down on this after thinking about it a bit is that the best practice is probably to clean off anything majorly dirty on the outside without water, then refrigerate it and wash it off before you use it. And even with store-bought eggs these days, when I crack eggs, then I'll go and wash my hands afterwards. And store-bought eggs are sanitized and all that, but it's still good practice. Yeah.
You said specifically that it's like temperature of the refrigerator that has to be at. What is that?
So refrigerators need to be below 42 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can buy a thermometer to put it in your fridge. Fridges tend to be in one of two places, either too cold and your lettuce is freezing, or kind of warm and then your food is spoiling more quickly. Below 42 degrees, most pathogens won't grow very well. So, yeah.
So don't wash them because it makes the shell more permeable.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a coating on the outside of the egg when it's laid that keeps things from getting in from the outside. Yeah.
Oh, is that kind of like that side experiment you do in like high school? You put the egg in like vinegar and get rid of the acid.
Yeah, well, it's similar, yeah, but it's actually like a membrane on the outside that's very fine. They call it a bloom.
Oh, is that like to make it like slide out of the cloaca?
It probably does help with that, yeah. Yeah.
Do you know how many different types of salmonella there are?
There are over 2,500 different serovars of salmonella. So how many of you have ever heard of a serovar? Okay. So if we think of genus, so genus is Salmonella, and then we have species Enterica. Salmonella Enterica actually has two subspecies. We only care about subspecies Enterica. And then below that is serovar. And serovar is the level at which our body can distinguish. So there's about 2,500 different types that our immune system can tell apart. There's about 20 that actually cause most of the illnesses in the US. So about 80% of the illnesses in the US are caused by 20 serovars. And those change a bit over time, but.
So how many different types of salmonella are found in chickens?
There is a number. Chickens are a major reservoir for salmonella, so I'd say you'd find at least a dozen different types commonly. And there's types that, like there's Salmonella galerum, I think, and that's not really a human one we're worried about, but chickens can get it. There's Pilorum typhoid. So Enteritis, typhimurium, and a random one that's just known as monophasic salmonella are really common in chickens. Heidelberg was a big deal a few years ago, but less so now.
Don't turtles get salmonella?
Yes.
Is it worse in chickens or turtles?
You're going to find similar types of salmonella sometimes. Yeah, so. Again, if you can think of a species of animal that it probably could have salmonella. Salmonella is very good at adapting. Yeah. Did you raise your hand?
Yeah. So if an egg is injected with salmonella, you can't tell like cracking it.
Yeah.
But if you cook it and then eat it, are you still susceptible to salmonella?
No. If you cook it properly, that will kill the salmonella. Yeah.
So I know some bacteria and viruses, after a certain amount of time, they die if they're not used or if they're not under like their ideal conditions. Is salmonella that way, or can it last a very long time?
It can last a fairly long time. There have been studies that if you put it on like a tabletop, 30 days later, you can still find some alive. And most of the time, if it's in nature, it's going to go and join with other bacteria in a community. So when I was talking about the countertop Countertops are a little bit less of a risk, but like your kitchen sink or your drain, especially if you like wash chicken in the sink, that's like a really potential big hotspot for salmonella. Because it's wet and there's a lot of nutrients to go through there. Yeah.
So I agree with a lot of the hygienic things that you said. I'm just curious if there's a point is that it's good for them to play in the soil because of the microbes and the bacteria. So when is that point for kids to be around farm animals and get exposed to that but not get sick?
Yeah, so you bring up an excellent point. Going back to the hygiene hypothesis, if you wrap a kid in bubble wrap, like immunological bubble wrap, and never let them get exposed to anything, it actually does them a disservice. The best thing is to expose them to a lot of harmless soil bacteria and try to minimize the risk of pathogens. Because salmonella can make a kid pretty sick, whereas like normal soil bacteria, it's going to be okay. So yeah, but I think probably if you have kids, the best thing is to keep the chickens in their own part of the yard penned, so you can control access to them and let the kids still be playing outside without the risk of salmonella being so high. Any other questions? I will just point out, I do try to keep this regularly updated as we go through our samples and find new things. It's like a website with information on best practices for chickens and salmonella and what we're finding in our study. And so if you are interested in keeping up with this project, you can check that out or send it to anyone you think needs to hear about it. Or wants to participate, that QR code will take you to the survey. The link will also take you to the survey. If you have chickens or are curious. We're kind of winding down our sampling for the fall, but if we would potentially do a few more. So. Thank you very much.